Senate leaders and House
Gephardt was one.
Gephardt in the House and Mitchell in the Senate saying, our president doesn't get it. He ought to go and dance on the wall to show the emotion we all feel, which would have been a stupid thing to do. Gorbachev has subsequently thanked me for not doing that, saying he didn't know how his own military was going to react. And so I use the word prudent a lot.
Yeah,
but it was prudent not to be out there grandstanding. And yet the emotion was such, and our Congress and really across the country, that they said the president ought to be out there doing this. And I didn't want to do that, and I think history will say I was right.
I'm sure, yeah, Gorbachev was thinking when he thanked you for doing that, I mean, it could have so enraged people in Russia that it would have whipped up the opposition to Gorbachev.
And he didn't know how, his military were feeling marginalized anyway. And his worry was, as he subsequently has told me, that they might just say, hey, we're going to show them that we're no pushover, and, you know, take up arms and get going. And they didn't, fortunately, and we have no blood on our hands because of it. But had we been saying, to the barricades, rally, do all this stuff, why, heavens know how the Russian troops would have responded.
It looks, in terms of the way that the Soviet Union itself fell apart and so on, as though we had overestimated, in a way, the strength of the Soviet Union. It was actually weaker than we had realized in the decade before it happened.
Well, that could be true, but we didn't test that, and fortunately we didn't test it to see how they would have reacted, you know, if they decided to use force. I know it could have been very bitter and brutal for Germany. You know, for a while, maybe not forever, because the U.S. could have come in there with Europe and rallied around.
Do you think the world is safer today than it was in the time of the Cold War?
No question. In my view, no question. There's far less danger of nuclear annihilation. There's still a worry, but far less than that. And there's far less danger of East-West confrontation with ground forces. I'm very relaxed about it, and I'm sure I'm right. But the Cold War, we forget, it was armed. People were armed, and people were. I'll never forget going through the little town in Germany, Mittelruth, and on one side was freedom, on the other side was tyranny, or East Germans. And you could see, one family looking across the fence would see other parts of the family over here. And I just found it obscene and hard to believe. But that's gone.
That has gone. And the relationship with Gorbachev over the years that followed, too, really was crucial in this situation, wasn't it? I mean, because history sometimes marches on personal relationships, and in that period around 1989, that's what happened, isn't it?
I think the personal relationships do matter. And they matter in that personal relationships can build trust. It could be, sometimes the trust can be misplaced. Sometimes events can overwhelm the trust. But if you have a personal relationship, if you think you know the heartbeat of the other guy, why, you're less likely to have two ships passing in the night, dark ships going their own way.
Was that probably the most historic moment of your presidency? November the 9th, or?
I think so. I think so, or the unification that followed.
Yeah.
The coming down of the wall and the unification was historic. I think it'll prove to be. Now, of course, you know, we had things like Desert Storm, where we said to a small country, Kuwait, we're not going to let you be taken over by a brutal neighbor. And I think that one, I took some satisfaction from that. But I think in terms of history, the coming down of the wall and the unification of Germany will be the most historic thing that happened on my watch.
And the reunification of Germany, I mean, Gorbachev had his doubts about that, as indeed did Margaret Thatcher, didn't she? But
I think she and Mitterrand both.
You must have persuaded him.
Well, Thatcher and Mitterrand, you could understand their reluctance, or their feeling we were going too fast backing the Germans, because, you know, they'd seen their own sons and daughters die in 2 wars on Europe, World War I, World War II. And they said they don't want a repeat of this. And they hadn't quite come along, as far as I had, feeling that Germany had earned its way into the family of free nations. So I could understand the differences, but they didn't try to block it, incidentally. They were just saying, well, you think this through.
Yeah, and in Hungary they gave you a piece of barbed wire, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
From the wall, and you wept when you saw it.
Yes, I didn't. Well, I weep at anything these days, David. I get very emotional. And it's a little embarrassing, frankly.
Well, I look forward to many more such interviews.
I hope
for another
so.
20 years.
You think so?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
I don't know how many more years will be. Well, you'll be here long. You're a young guy.
Yes.
I'm not sure.
I'm 70. How old are you?
I'm 85.
85.
There's a hell of a difference between 85 and 84, too. No, but life is good for us. But I don't do stuff anymore. I don't do interviews. Very, 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 very rare interview. And I'd much prefer to just be back in Houston or in Maine and letting historians decide what we got right and what we may have screwed up, and then get on with life. And our son was president, so I reveled in that. I ached, hurt with the criticism he got, much of which I thought was unfair, some of which was fair, but much of which unfair. But it hurts when you see your own flesh and blood in the crossfire. So now we're out of that, and life is very happy for us. We got our own family, and it's great.
George Bush there, the former